Hi, Eric. This is Dantel. Let me know when you're ready to get started. Hi, everyone. We'll be getting started in just a few moments.
Dantel, sound check, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Yes, I hear you.
Okay, great. Thank you. I'm all ready when you are.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dantel Proctor from the National Student Attendance Engagement and Success Center. Welcome to today's webinar, Linking School Climate, Cultural Responsiveness, and Exclusionary Discipline to Chronic Absenteeism. To start, I would like to share some brief details about today's webinar. Our presenter is Dr. Eric Toshalis from the National Student Attendance Engagement and Success Center. Dr. Toshalis is the Research Director of the Student-Centered Learning Research Collaborative, part of the Students at the Center initiative at Jobs for the Future. A former middle and high school teacher, union president, and teacher educator with 25 years of experience in public secondary schools, Dr. Toshalis is the co-author of Understanding Youth, Adolescent Development for Educators, and the author most recently of Make Me, Understanding and Engaging Student Resistance in School, both published by Harvard Education Press. Today's webinar will last for approximately 60 minutes with time for questions. We will be placing everyone on mute. Please do not unmute yourself, but instead refer to the chat function at the top of the screen if you have a question. Please feel free to log your questions as the presenter is talking, and we'll leave some time at the end to answer them. If we do not have enough time to get through all of the questions, we will reply to all participants by email within the next 5 to 7 days. We encourage you to ask questions or simply share a comment. Today's webinar is one of a number being offered by the Technical Assistance Center during 2017. The center is new. It is funded by the Department of Education, specifically the Office of Safe and Healthy Students. Our website is currently being developed, and we hope to have it up and running in the coming weeks. Before I hand over to Eric, I want to share with you the mission of our national center. The mission of the center is to disseminate evidence-based practices and build and facilitate communities of practice to help students attend every day, be engaged in school, and succeed academically so that they graduate high school prepared for college, career, and civic life. Eric, I pass it on to you now.
Fantastic, Dantel. Thank you so much for setting this all up and making it run so smoothly. Apologies to everyone for the audio glitches there early on, but we should be all set here. Yeah, my name is Eric, and I'm excited to be on this call and webinar with you all here. This is an increasingly important issue as we think about how to move our schools and our communities into 21st century relationships with kids and prepare them for college and career readiness. The issue of absenteeism and dropout and push out and skipping school continues to sort of alert all of us that are close to kids to think about how best to design learning environments to serve kids' needs to make sure that they're making the best decisions they can. So if we go to the next slide, the objectives for today's webinar are really to get right into some of those specifics about how we can do that. One is to identify the key contextual and institutional factors that can contribute to students' chronic absenteeism, to describe the practices known to support student engagement, motivation, and attendance, and also to provide some suggested resources for further investigation and implementation, although many of those resources will be supplied online when our website is fully built out. So it'll be sort of a coming attractions thing. Next slide, please. I want to begin before we dive into some of the research and the practices and what we know about best support, how we can most support kids to make the decision to be at school, to just highlight a key point. And that is one that many of us heard in our teacher education programs or our leadership programs that we attended, or we've learned through our own research, that where we look determines what we're going to see. And for my purposes today, I'm going to describe for you where we are going to look. There are many factors that contribute to chronic absenteeism. Some of them are located for sure in the context and the habits and decisions of the individual student and her, his, or their family. And that's an important place to look. However, that's not where I'm going to look today. I'm not interested in deciding or in looking into issues that occur within families that may be stressed by poverty or illness or addiction, or they need job training or community resources. Instead, I'm going to focus on the procedures, relationships, and learning environments that we establish for learners in our schools and examine the extent to which the way that those learning environments are constructed may actually contribute to students' decisions not to attend school. And so this presentation really is located on the latter, and I make no claims about whether this is stronger or better or a more important thing to focus on. It just happens to be where my area of expertise is most robust. The next slide, please. Thank you. When we think about adolescence in particular, and a lot of this applies, of course, to elementary schools, but for purposes of this conversation today, we're going to focus on middle and high school kids, where we see most of the chronic absenteeism really flaring. What I want to begin with is thinking about what it takes to get motivated to attend school. And for students to decide to attend regularly and engage purposefully, they need a whole host of different factors around them to encourage that decision-making. And those things are psychological, they're social, they're institutional, they're political, and they're pedagogical processes that influence students to make that decision. And oftentimes you'll hear people, myself included, who will parse or sort of hair splitting between what are intrinsic and extrinsic factors that motivate students to decide to engage actively in school and decide to attend. And I'm going to make a little bit of an argument today, and I can't stand too squarely on this one, that I'm not sure it really matters for our conversation today to determine which are intrinsic and which are extrinsic motivators. And the reason for that is that the catalyst for behavior in many situations really may be external, but is integrated into one's internal drives and desires. So that parsing whether it's intrinsic or extrinsic really sort of falls away. It doesn't really matter. And one thing we know again and again and again is that for external pressures, for external factors to really be intrinsically integrated into one's sense of self and sense of purpose and future aspirations, the relationships between who is the actual student and who's supplying those external motivators has to be really strong, or it has to be productive, or it has to be deemed worthy and helpful and happy by the individual student. All of that is to say that if we really want to compel students to do the things that we're saying that they should do, they're more likely to do them when we have good relationships with them. That's when they internalize our extrinsic motivators into internal processes. So the key point here is that all students, every single one of them, even the most resistant, even the ones that are dropped out, they all desire learning experiences that offer opportunities for novelty, challenge, competence, autonomy, belonging, and meaning. And each one of those has a rich research base behind it that establishes why novelty and why our brains are hardwired to look for and ask questions and want to learn new things. We literally have a self-fulfilling prophecy that is as chemical as it is psychological, as it is social in our brains that make us want to learn new things and actually experience joy when we do. We get a little dopamine squirt in our bodies when we feel like we're learning something new. We also love challenge. We also love the experiences of competence. We also love feeling like we're doing it on our own and that we're connected to others and that we have some sort of meaning. When those things aren't occurring, and if they're chronically lacking in learning experiences in school, students will tend to withdraw, they'll tend to resist, they'll tend to act out, and they'll tend to turn toward other non-academic pursuits that may lead them away from school and away from attending school regularly. So for my money, if I want to put my resources, if I were running a school or school systems or working at state policy level, the things that I would most want to focus on would be the ones that I would be able to change. And that's the learning environment around the student that compels them to want to be there, how we motivate them. Next slide, please. So if we want students to be able to muster multiple answers to the question, why should I do this? And that's what we want to do. We have to think about what does the student need to feel like they want to do that. And really what we know is that when more of those answers to that question are minimal or strained or non-existent, the motivation for that student to show up and to lean into that work will also be minimal and strained or non-existent, which is why, and I think I can say this and it will be largely agreed upon, although there's lots of arguments to go with this, I don't believe that there's any such thing as an unmotivated student. And I think part of the reason we have quote-unquote unmotivated students, or why we think we have those in schools, is because we start with that assumption. Really, I think it's much more powerful and we are much more agents and we're much better to change the circumstances around students when we understand that demotivating contexts in which students are working are provided. That is what's creating for them a lack of motivation to engage. So it's not that there's a thing as an unmotivated student, it's that there's demotivating context around that student. And what I can say to support that is that if you can show me any student that one might call unmotivated in school, I will show you probably a half dozen things that that student does with a whole lot of interest and effort and time expended and focus and connections that are social outside of school that they're very motivated to do. The question is, what is it that's surrounding those activities, whether it's a sport or it's video games or it's hanging out with friends in the park or it's reading or it's drawing or something. There's something that that particular student is interested in and knows how to muster energy to be successful at. We have to figure out how to create those opportunities in school for kids to make them more motivated to attend. Next slide, please. So, host of different ways to think about it that all fall under this term called school climate. And school climate, variously defined, is basically the conditions under which we expect students to learn, to get along with each other, and to be motivated enough to attend another day. And I want to highlight several, and believe me, this list here that's on this page here is by no means exhaustive. It's sort of a greatest hits of the research that I think is most compelling. The first one is the need to belong. We have these incredibly robust egos that we develop in our adolescence, but they're equally matched by what's called the we-go. So there's the ego, my internal sense of balancing my external needs with my internal drives. The we-go is my need to feel connected to others in some meaningful way and to be included, invited, and feel like a sense of belonging in that. Those experiences are richly confirming for us because they go back to the deepest parts of our brain that realized when we were basically closer to Neanderthals than we are to the modern 21st century humans, that if we left the tribe or the tribe left us, that there was a saber-toothed tiger around the corner that was probably ready to come and take us out. So our need to belong was a survival instinct. The more we stayed close to others, the more likely we would survive. And we have not relinquished that. We're still very social animals. The caveat to this is that we've done through multiple forms of research, mostly ethnographic, that we studied that when students feel like they overbelong, meaning that they're super attached to a very small clique that has very rigid boundaries around it. In other words, my clique, my group will not interact with other groups. That lack of mixing with diversity in a particular learning environment can actually create risk-taking behaviors and foment problems with social relationships that could actually contribute to students feeling afraid to go to school because there's too much friction, there's too much drama. So it's not just that they need to belong, we also need to make sure that kids have multiple opportunities to interact with others who are not like them, who don't think like them, who don't come from backgrounds that they come from, in order to feel the possibilities of expanding their social sphere and learning how to think differently. It's really important to have both belonging and intergroup mixing. By the same token, challenge and support. We know that students often feel over-challenged by certain learning environments. The sink or swim pedagogical ethic, we know again and again and again, does not work for students. They need to feel as though there's a balance between how much they're being challenged to try something that's at the edge of their abilities and how much they're being supported to achieve and get the esteem for that achieve around their peers. And one trick to doing this, one way to think about this, of course, goes back to Vygotsky and the zone of proximal development. But one way of thinking about the challenge versus support kind of relationship, sort of XY axis here, is to make sure that every time you take up a notch the level of difficulty or the level of expectations, that you're making sure that you're providing sufficient supports for students to reach there, so that kids know that the expectations are high, but that so are the scaffolds to make sure that they can get to that next level. And those scaffolds are crucial for students, particularly students who feel marginalized or who are likely to feel alienated or feel dumb in learning environments. Those students particularly need a fair amount of support to make sure they feel like they can do it. Now, the danger is that if support is too great for students, they're going to be bored, uninspired, unchallenged, and they're going to look for those activities outside of school or in social relationships or in the shenanigans that kids can get involved in to make things more interesting. So balancing challenge and support can be a key motivator for students to decide to want to go to school because they get so much out of it. Next would be voice and choice. The more we look into the way that students understand themselves as they grow into adult ways of thinking, adult ways of knowing, and adult ways of interacting in society and more civic preparedness, the more we realize that we have to give them practice at those things. They're not going to be good at them until they get a chance to try them. And that means we have to give them opportunities for expression, opportunities for leadership, opportunities to make choices about the things that they want to study, how they study them, and how they'll be assessed when it's time for them to perform their particular level of competence or mastery. Voice and choice is really crucial. For classrooms that have very little agency or ownership over the learning, for learning environments where students have very little opportunity to make decisions about how they're going to conduct themselves or do something with others or do something on their own, those environments tend to be demotivating and alienating, particularly for older adolescents who want to expand their capabilities and be ready for adult ways of interacting in a complex world. So I can't say enough about voice and choice, and there's lots of organizations around the United States who are doing some beautiful work. Grip Tape is a foundation that's doing just some beautiful stuff. There's the Student Voice Initiative, and they're having a conference this coming summer in Burlington, Vermont. The work by Dana Mitra is really fantastic in that regard. Lots of really good work out there to consult and techniques to use to enhance voice and choice. Another one would be teacher-student relationships. I'm just going to say briefly on this one because it's fairly self-explanatory, but the more that teachers are able to connect before they correct students, the more students will feel like this is a place that honors who they are, and the more they feel like they can take risks in front of teachers who won't make fun of them or embarrass them in front of their peers. So teacher-student relationships are absolutely crucial, and whenever I work with either veteran teachers or newly inducted teachers or in teacher education settings with pre-service teachers, I underscore again and again and again, if you have not connected with one of your students in the last 2 weeks, and you know that that kid, you've had no meaningful interaction with that student, make sure in your lesson plans, in your notes or whatever, that you find a way, informally or formally, to have a positive relational connection to that kid. If you have 175 students on a daily basis, I don't think it's possible to connect with every one of them on a daily basis, but maybe over a 2-week period, you can make sure that you have even just short little blips of connections or, hey, how you doing in the classroom. You'll see kids' postures change. You'll see the way they walk a little straighter. You see the way they smile a little bit bigger when we just give them these quick ways to connect. And then from there, you can build a foundation to deeper awareness and deeper connections with them that will drive their decision to stay in school. Ownership of learning sort of connects with the voice and choice before. In agency, we really have to make sure, not so much blaming kids when they don't want to learn, which we'll talk about in a minute, but making sure that opportunities for students to feel like the learning is theirs and that it's personally relevant to them and it's connected to their lives, really crucial for them to want to come to school and stay in school. Personalization, really hot word right now. All the tech firms out there in the United States are really doing some fantastic work at showing different ways that we can use technology platforms to cater specific learning opportunities for kids. But the word personalization is far more than technology. It's the way that we differentiate our instruction. It's the way that we modify our particular pedagogical techniques. It's the way we relate differently to different students who need different things from us. It's all the different ways that we make learning connected to what the student's agenda is and what the student needs in that classroom. Really important, particularly for kids who feel marginalized and alienated. Recognition is a concept that comes from a lot of ethnic identity work. Students need to feel like school is for me, that they're recognized there, that this is a place where I know I can be successful. I see other people like me who are successful here. I have other people I can connect to who are close to or different from me, that are resonating for me, that this is a place for me. I feel invited, I feel recognized, I feel known here. Really important aspects for kids to experience. Performance versus mastery orientation is a huge part of school climate. The more we focus on mastery learning, the more students will want to feel their development over time. The more they'll try harder, the more they'll feel this sort of the mindset stuff, the more they're willing to try to show and demonstrate their mastery, because they know that it's not an end point. They know that it's the next point on their ongoing development to get better and better and better at the things that they apply effort and time to. Performance orientations tend to be counter-motivating and often alienating for many students because they focus all on the performance as the be-all, end-all, and they don't focus on the kids developing skills and assets over time. Instead, they put too much stress on sort of game day. And that can be really stressful for many kids who have enough negative experiences in getting the C's and D's and F's on the game day, when they know that this isn't going to be the best they're ever going to do in their life. This is the best I can do today, and then let's see how I can get better and better and better. So master orientations are much better. To that end, early and frequent little wins are really important for students to feel like there's incremental progress over time and that they're getting smarter, more capable, and more efficacious over time. Competition is actually a negative for many students, particularly those students who are scared to go to school and feel like they're the dumb one. So I would highly recommend that schools who are, or teachers or systems that are using competitive models to try to motivate students, highly recommend that they remind themselves that every time you set up a competitive model, you are setting up the conditions to create losers. And I would argue that in a compulsory education format that we have in the United States, students are required to attend school, to set up grading regimes or to set up competitions in classrooms in some sort of way that sets up some students to be losers while others be winners. It might be an ethical transgression there. So competition is often great for the one or two that wins, but for the rest of the people that don't win, particularly in a compulsory context, not so good. Tracking, other forms of ability grouping. Boy, folks, the more we study this one, the more we realize this can be a major turnoff to many kids, particularly those who have chronically negative experiences with the way that they've been assessed in school and the way they've been told that they're not smart or that they're a quote-unquote hands-on learner, or all of those myths. Tracking and ability grouping is one of the main reasons why many students decide that they're no longer going to go, because they're not tracks, they're ruts. They know that once you get in the lower tracks that there's no way out of those, and if they have different aspirations for themselves, a logical psychological decision for them is to avoid the intellectual and social harm of being being labeled the dumber one every time you go to school, and instead go elsewhere where you can feel smart. And those places might be at the park, or they might be at home with a video game, or they might be in relationships that we would choose them not to be successful in, particularly if they get involved in gang activity or that sort of stuff. So tracking and ability grouping, not a fan, and there's lots of research out there to support that is a negative, that is a contributing factor to students' decision not to attend school. Bullying, lots of stuff about bullying, don't need to go too much into that one, but kids who experience bullying in school, particularly when they feel as though the adults at that school are not doing anything about it, or that they don't see it, or they're not aware of it, those students will drop out. The statistics are quite alarming over time. If that's not addressed, kids would rather feel safe, and that means they're not going to attend school with a lot of bullying. Same goes for racial or ethnic or linguistic heritage or gender expression or LGBTQ issues. Any of the microaggressions that attach to particular identity performances can really build up in a student's minds and make a school feel very safe for them, such that they make the right decision to no longer attend that space. So all of these things are school climate. The more we pay attention to school climate, the more we're going to be finding out where students are feeling most safe, where the feeling that school is most for them, and where the areas may be negative for them that they might not want to attend, which brings me to the next slide. The takeaway here is really, we're not going to be able to change what we don't understand. How do we understand what we need to change? We need to make friends with data. And that means capturing how your students perceive their learning environment. How is that best done? There are lots of different ways to do that. Some admittedly require purchasing sometimes expensive, sometimes inexpensive instruments that are offered by organizations or foundations. Some of them are free that you can find online. But basically, there's surveys that kids fill out to tell you about how they perceive their learning environment and the school climate in which you're asking them to attend and take risks and try new things in front of others. If you send out those surveys and you start them out, do them in September, and then check again in April or May, and analyze those data, I encourage you when you do so to move far beyond the averages. I've often seen schools where they do a good job of administering these surveys, but in the end they find out that, oh, we're about 85% of the students feel like school is safe. Well, that's great. Let's move on. Well, that means there's 15% of the kids at your school who are not feeling that it's safe. We need to find out what that 15% is doing. If we stop at the averages, we're actually removing all of the outliers that can tell us most what we need to know about the areas of school, the areas of our relationships, the areas of our pedagogy, how we design our curriculum, how we interact with kids in the hallway and the bus stops, all those different things, bathroom stuff, stairwell stuff. That will tell us exactly how the kids who are most at risk of dropping out and being chronically absent, how those kids feel. So when you do analyze your data, make sure that you're moving beyond the averages and you're drilling into the outliers and finding out what they think and what they feel. That will tell you where you can most change. And I would recommend also implementing either an engagement or a motivation checklist among your faculty and work in teams to add to it as you discover which practices are most compelling for your student. In Chapter 5 of my book, Make Me, I offer a suggested beginning list of a motivation checklist, and it's basically a way for educators to check themselves to find out, are they doing the kinds of things in their classrooms and in their school that we know through research make kids feel like they are motivated and want to try and apply effort and come to school. Same with engagement. You can look up an engagement checklist. I would recommend the work of Jenny Fredericks at Connecticut College. She's done some fantastic stuff around how students, how to understand engagement from a teacher's perspective so that we know how to be student-centered in our approaches. But if you create these little checklists, they're great informal ways for teachers to check each other and to find out whether or not they're actually creating opportunities for kids to lean in, engage, and attend school and be successful in doing so. Next slide, please. So this is a huge one. Cultural responsiveness is a different way of saying it. We used to call it cultural competence, and I don't like the word cultural competence because it assumes that we get to a spot where we're kind of done. Well, I'm now competent. I can talk to other cultures and sort of that I'm okay, you're okay, we're okay kind of, now we're done. Can we all just get along kind of a model? And I much prefer cultural responsiveness because it suggests the constantly shifting nature of our relationships and how important it is to work across cultural barriers. And I want to make one point that is a little difficult to get here. I sort of hinted at it earlier when we were talking about tracking. And that point is at the top here. When we make ability differences salient in learning environments, okay? In other words, when we somehow establish either explicitly or implicitly that some students in here are doing better than others and are deemed to be better students than others in this environment, whether that's through the college prep versus honors versus AP labels that we may put on kids in the classes they attend, or whether we say, you know, Juan is a hands-on learner, but Jimmy is an academic learner and a verbal learner, or the way that we levy plays. Whenever we appraise, whenever we make ability differences an important aspect of the learning environment, we should expect that students are going to resist and withdraw, and that their performance is going to drop, particularly among students who already experience school as a marginalizing environment for them as a result of their culture, their socioeconomic class, their gender identity expression, their special needs status, their immigrant status, any one of those various categories. And what we need to admit to ourselves, and this is hard work to do for schools that are really committed to some of these sorting and ranking regimes, is that those sorting and ranking regimes are very raced and are often very classed. And our cultural responsiveness is often hindered by the extent to which we buy into old ways of labeling kids based on what we think is a good student, what we think a good student looks and sounds like, that are often really just ways to perpetuate white middle-class forms of supremacy in our culture. And what I want to argue here is one way to start to dismantle that is that there's no such thing as a kid who doesn't want to learn. There are no such things as kids who are not motivated. There are only contexts where a kid doesn't want to learn. A kid may not want to learn from you. A kid may not want to learn here. A kid may not want to learn this content. A kid may not want to learn today after what happened to them this morning or the night before. But there is no such thing as a kid who just pervasively doesn't want to learn. And our sorting and ranking regimes and our lack of cultural responsiveness and the way that those regimes often demonstrate our lack of cultural responsiveness can actually exacerbate those opinions. And it's really easy for us to blame the student rather than looking at what we're doing. And my favorite author and researcher who really opened this field up is Angela Valenzuela, who wrote a book called Subtractive Schooling. And she looked at how subtractive schooling processes can be toxic and alienating, particularly for kids. She was working in the schools in southern Texas, and she worked, I think, in El Paso. And those experiences can frustrate students' attempts to be successful and contribute to their desire to no longer attend those toxic and alienating environments, and so they drop out. Students need to preserve their authenticity while they're belonging to school. If we say the price of being successful at this school is assimilating to these mainstream norms, that is too much of a price to pay for kids who are already feeling alienated by this culture or alienated by mainstream expectations in school. So we don't want to have them say, hey, Juan, I want you to be successful here, but you have to sound like Jimmy in order to be successful here. That's the only way to do it. Juan should be able to sound like Juan sounds like and still be successful at school. School should find a way to represent him. We shouldn't just expect that Juan only represents school. And what we know from psychological research and from sociology is that the forced assimilation, the desire or the expectation that so-called others will assimilate is a psychologically damaging process. It actually forces people to cleave who they are from where they'll be accepted, and that makes them dissociate from academic environments, and it makes them want to drop out. So really, many students would rather be bad than to feel dumb or to feel uninvited, and therefore they will choose negative behaviors, which could include dropping out or skipping school, would also include a whole bunch of other stuff that would typically fall under, misbehavior and disciplinary issues. But students will often choose to be bad because it feels like an agentic choice. I'm choosing to be this person rather than letting you define who I am. You're saying that I'm negative. Well, I'm going to be negative on my terms. And one of the worst ways that we can respond to kids is with forms of care that really care only about their grades, only about their attendance, only about their tardies, only about their dress code adherence, only about their use of the proper language in the classroom. We're paying attention to a lot of the dressing, but the real meat of the issue right there is whether they feel authentically cared for and whether they can show up as an authentic self at that school. Can one be a Mexicano at school and still be considered a good student? You know, can Can a lesbian student who's out at school be fully accepted for who she is in that particular moment as she's understanding her gender identity expression and her sexual orientation? These are huge questions for schools to wrestle with, but they're crucial questions for schools to wrestle with if we're really going to attack and understand and try to address the issues that often compel students not to attend school. Next slide, please. So another couple key items here would be with the need to reduce stereotype threat and the experiences that trigger it. I can't get too deep into this research because it's fairly complicated, but there are lots of fantastic websites and books. Claude Steele's work on stereotype threat is just fantastic about this, but there are lots of ways that all minoritized populations, anyone who feels minoritized and marginalized, that we can create the learning context that force people to spend way too much psychological energy worrying about whether they're confirming a stereotype. And that means they have less available in their minds cognitively to focus on the academic task at hand. And that stereotype threat actually is a contextual problem. It's not a problem with the individual. It's a problem with the context around the individual. And the extent to which educational environments create and foment stereotype threat, really you can tie that directly to the underperforming outcomes that you'll see students give and their lack of comfort in those environments. Another insight would come from Janelle Smith. She's a fantastic researcher who wrote about tough fronts. And this is basically making sure that we're not picking up on the tough attitudes, the cool poses, the hyper-masculine postures that many of our students will often give when they have to come from the streets to the classroom or from difficult home life or difficult neighborhoods to the classroom. And they don't quickly just turn those off like it's a light switch. They don't come into the classroom after having had to protect themselves and keep from getting in fights or to front or to be threatening to suddenly turn it off when they greet the teacher and then sit down and say, "Good morning, Mr. Toshalis, I'm so glad to be here today. What are we doing in history class?" Like, that's just not going to happen. So what we need to do is to recognize those tough fronts and give them a chance to transition and not read their behaviors as being emblematic of gangster, of being in a gang or wanting to be in a gang, that they might just be fronting that in order to get through their days a little bit, and that it's a front. They do want to be successful in school. They want to feel smart. They want to feel connected. They want to belong, and that some of that stuff that they're doing in front of that is just a way to sort of keep them from being laughed at. I would ask that schools that are looking to be culturally responsive pay attention to their curriculum. Who is invisible and who is visible in their curriculum? Who is lifted up in the curriculum as being an exemplar? And this goes for all. This is science classes, this is math classes, English language arts. This is history, social science. We really need to be paying attention to whether our curriculum is representing and showing students not just that they're included here, but that we want to honor the groups from which they spring, the communities, the linguistic heritage that most informs the languages that they dream in. Same with staffing. Who's overrepresented on our staff and who's underrepresented on our staff? They've traced the effects of that on particular underrepresented students to see that the lack of connection to others who look like me, sound like me, who get me, can create experiences for students where they don't feel like school represents them, so they don't show up. So we have to make sure that our hiring practices and our recruitment strategies are really prioritizing making sure that the demographics of our staffing get as close as possible to matching the students that we serve. And last, I would say, at least on this cultural responsiveness component here, that connections with family are huge, but we need to be really careful with how we frame those connections. There are a lot of white middle class assumptions about quote unquote parental involvement when parents are available, i.e. lots of folks don't work 9 to 5 anymore. There's all kinds of work environments that work multiple hours on all different times of the day and the night and the morning. We need to be thinking about that. There are people that are working 3 or 4 jobs just to get by, particularly in expensive communities. So make sure that the connections with the family, if you're really trying to prevent chronic absenteeism, are representative of the realities that those families are facing. And in many cases, that means we have to go to them and instead of expecting them to come to us. Next slide, please. So a couple summary ideas or takeaways about cultural responsiveness. The decision to skip school or be chronically absent really can be understood as a rational, self-saving response to a learning environment that's experienced as toxic. It's easy for us to blame the student or the family for making bad decisions and not supporting that student, but the work really should be for us to find the stuff that we're doing to contribute to that. And schools will tend to default to mainstream norms unless efforts to expand and enhance cultural responsiveness are undertaken. So really, to what extent are the educators in our system or in our schools prepared to reach and teach students from marginalized race, class, ethnic, linguistic backgrounds? How about are those kids with learning differences, or those who are in foster homes, or those who are transgender students, kids who have experienced trauma? We have to ask these questions, and we have to be really brave in getting faculty and getting administrators and getting systems to ask those questions in ways that are generative, that get people to look at their practices and do the hard work of making sure where there are gaps and blank spots, we have work to do. And there are so many resources out there for how to initiate and sustain conversations that will help us reveal which practices will make learning environments more culturally responsive. I'm really familiar with the work of Courageous Conversations and the Pacific Education Group and the work that they've done. That is a terrific starter model. It can't take you all the way there, but it's a great way to start those conversations and get educators talking about how they best reach and teach kids. All right, next slide, please. So this is the last major topic I want to focus on, and then we'll conclude and open it up to some conversation here. One, and really this is another one of those it's on us kind of a things, and that is exclusionary discipline. The more we research it, the more we know, particularly through the My Brother's Keeper, the Dear Colleague letter from January of 2014 from the Department of Education, the efforts of the Office of Civil Rights have indicated again and again and again that zero tolerance policies, corporal punishment, which is still legal, I believe, in 18, might be 19 states, that even suspensions and expulsions have all demonstrated negative effects, particularly for students who are already feeling, I know I keep saying that, particularly for students who are already feeling alienated and marginalized at school. So if we think about it, learning to live in a community and develop the social emotional skills that's required of us really makes, we have to have deepening relationships. We shouldn't be removing them. But that's what we do when we use zero tolerance policies and suspensions and expulsions. We have to remind ourselves that students act immature because they've not yet matured. Many educators really need a lot of help in learning how to teach and reinforce behavior rather than punish behavior. Kids are learning how to behave, and punishment actually, although it seems really valuable and effective at the time, punishment actually can be highly negative for many students because it turns the caring nurturer into a pain provider or to someone who is now becoming sort of judge, jury, and executioner in a situation in school, and that is not a relationship we want to cultivate with kids. Educators try to establish engaging and structured learning environments, but we often end up with chaotic and repressive or overly permissive classrooms, and it's just as negative for students to go to school and feel like it's just a place to hang out as it is for them to come to school and feel like it's overly repressive. We do have to hold them accountable, and we do have to find ways to establish rich learning environments with high expectations, but we've also got to connect with them in some sort of way. Disciplinary procedures, we know, really privilege white middle-class ways of behaving, which can further alienate already vulnerable populations, which is why I would recommend checking out the Dignity in Schools campaign and looking at their resolutions and their suggestions for language and policies and procedures to include at systems levels, at the building level, and even in the classroom level. They've really done a fantastic job at using research-driven practices to understand how best to react to students in non-exclusionary discipline ways, in restorative ways. Again, that's Dignity in Schools campaign. They have some terrific resources online. So let's go to the next slide, please. So the takeaway here is just, let's think about what message we're sending here, that we send students away when they break rules. You're suspended, right? You get a detention. Or we're going to keep it off the books by calling it in-school work day and not calling it a suspension, which is what many districts are doing to try not to post the same sort of data that they had before when there were all those suspensions occurring and when it became sort of a highlighted issue. But the lesson we're sending to that student in that moment is that exclusion, that forced absence, is a way to resolve difficulties in learning and relating. That's what we're teaching them. No wonder that many students choose to be absent when schooling experiences are difficult, because we taught them that strategy. Look, things get really bad, you don't get to come here. And the student then turns around and says, things have been really bad there, I'm not going to go there. And then we tell them that's the wrong pull. Well, we taught them that. So I would argue that restorative practices pull students in when harm has been done, when misbehavior has been perceived, when interactions that have detracted from the learning environment occur. Restorative practices pull students in rather than push them away. They offer opportunities to create community, to solve problems, and to establish real accountability, not just punitive, retributive forms of accountability. So highly recommend looking into the restorative practice. Lots and lots of resources out there in establishing those things. Oakland comes to mind, Oakland, California, as being one of the leaders in that movement. But I would argue, as I do in the bottom here, that any outreach to struggling families or struggling students really needs to be matched by our own in-reach efforts to assess the developmental and the cultural appropriateness of our learning environments that we give to those students. We really have to ask questions about ourselves and our schools as equally as we ask about our students and families. And that's going back to the very first point I made on that I think that second or third slide, which is, of course, there are problems in students and families, and of course, they often make bad decisions. But the same can be said about our schools, our educators, and the way we set learning opportunities around those students. We have work to do is the takeaway there. So some final conclusions here with this last slide, and then we'll open it up to conversation. Just a metaphor here. Gardeners and farmers know what it takes to make plants flourish. And that is, they don't blame the plants when the plants don't grow. Instead, they examine the soil, the sun, the water, and the nutrients they provide to nourish them. We are educators, systems level leaders, policymakers, whoever you may be. We're sort of the gardeners and farmers of learning environments. And it behooves us to not blame the students when they're not growing the way that we would hope to, or when they don't show up. Instead, we really need to look at how we're providing the right nutrients and the right context around those students. And I would argue we should do that before we blame the least powerful person in that environment, which is the student or the family. We should be looking at what we're doing. And so that's why I say at the bottom, if we seek to eliminate chronic absenteeism, and I know we do, we need to focus some of our efforts on analyzing and changing the components over which we have the most control. You really cannot change individual students' decision-making in the short term. Long term you can, but it's a lot of work. What we have the most opportunity to change in the short term is our climate, our cultural responsiveness, our disciplinary strategies, and our relationships with our students. That's the stuff we're in control of. That's the stuff we should focus on changing first. So with that, I want to open, we can just keep it on this slide. For that, I would like to open it up to any questions or comments. I know that Dentel has been kind of curating those behind the scenes. Dentel, are there any questions from folks there that would be worth raising here?
We don't have any questions as of yet, Eric. Wow.
That means I've been so compelling that it's so crystal clear that people have nothing to say. That's amazing. I will not assume that, actually. One option might be here, Dentel, let me know what you think about this, would be to unmute the line and see if there's anyone who wants to raise their hand or some other aspect here to pose a question live. I'm happy to do that if the technology allows.
Yeah, we can definitely do that. I've just unmuted everyone.
Is there anyone out there in Radio Land?
Here we go. Today is me. 2 days. 120.
So, Eric, we did get a question from Patty Saka. I'm sorry, Patty, if I'm mispronouncing your last name. The question is, can you talk more about restorative discipline practices?
Absolutely. I mean, I'm sort of a practitioner, but I can tell you this, that restorative practices is an umbrella term for a whole host of different approaches that include things like circles, that includes check-in time at the beginning of class, it includes class meetings, it includes often different forms of conflict resolution that look different when students are sort of in charge of it. There are a whole host of techniques that are used, some of which are detailed in my book, Make Me, but there are much richer resources that focus concretely on that. I don't have a specific resource in mind other than if you were to Google restorative practices in Oakland, You're going to get videos of the things that they've done there. You're going to get examples of the way that they structure circles. And there are multiple organizations, national and international. In fact, in many ways, the United States is sort of quite behind in this regard. The UK in particular led with a lot of really rich efforts, and then places in, particularly in South Africa and post-apartheid South Africa, there were lots of things that emerged after the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that were fantastic and in showing what's possible when you have a restorative approach rather than a retributive approach. And really, truthfully, these methods have been called many different things, but they've been practiced for thousands of years by First Nations peoples and by tribes around the world as a way to keep people in the fold instead of ostracize them and sort of send them out into the desert when they've done wrong. And, you know, I would encourage you to look for some of those videos and some of those resources online. There are a few that are just beautiful when you watch kids engage each other and talk about harm and talk about how to repair that harm. And then kids feel like they're an agent instead of being sent out. They feel like they're listened to and heard. And yes, of course, it takes time and it takes training. And in order for people to do it well, it really needs to be done system-wide or at least school-wide for it to really be successful. And that takes some time. But anything that's worth the effort, anything that's really worthwhile usually takes that kind of effort. So totally encourage it. I'm sure that didn't give you the specifics you were looking for, but I'm actually not as qualified because I've been away from as a classroom educator for too long to actually have done that, and what I've been doing is researching and looking into it. So highly recommend finding that. And we'll make sure we post some restorative justice links when we put some resources up here in the next couple of weeks. Other questions, Dantel?
Yes. Stephanie Geller would like to know, what state-level policy changes do you recommend to change the current situation?
Excellent. State-level policy changes. One would be free up resources to pay and expect that teachers, as part of the ESSA rollout, that the fifth indicator that states use to determine school effectiveness include rich school climate measures, and that resources are allocated to make sure that the instruments that are used are asking the questions you want to get, and that the people on the ground who are making meaning of the survey data that they receive are following up with the kids who didn't respond positively. In other words, don't go with just the averages. Yay for you that you get 85% of students who say that you want to, but that's still 15 out of 100 students in your school who are saying, you know, publicly, I'm not comfortable here, I'm not safe here. We need to find out what those students are. So one, make sure your fifth indicator when you apply for ESSA funds, and I think next fall, I believe, is when states need to start sending that to the feds, that your fifth indicator has school climate measures and are good, valid, and reliable instruments, and that people have the training that they need in order to implement them and make meaning of them. Another thing would be to get rid of exclusionary discipline policies and don't let districts cook the books, if that makes sense. That would mean, and basically making sure that if they are going to get rid of suspension and expulsion, except for the most extreme cases, that they don't just create in-school suspension and call it something else in order to take it off the books. Often the state systems or district systems that they use to gather data about suspensions and disciplinary interactions and stuff are so antiquated that they don't allow for the nuances in decision making and the outreach and the relational stuff that's needed in order to really help the students. So I would look at the instruments that you're paying for in your states to make sure that they're up for the task, and then I would make sure that exclusionary disciplinary practices like zero tolerance policies, suspensions and stuff are replaced with more restorative methods, and to provide significant funding. And I know that's tough for districts, but districts don't learn this stuff overnight. And if it's implemented poorly and teachers don't get the support that they need to do it well, it can actually force a retreat and a backlash, and you'll get even more retributive models of discipline than you had before. And we're seeing that in districts around the country. Even the media is starting to report that now, that this district went away from suspensions, and now look, they're having way more problems. Well, look a little bit deeper, get some information on the ground, and what you'll often find when you scratch the surface there is that people are angry because they feel like they weren't provided, people meaning teachers, weren't provided with the resources they need in order to actually make real changes in the classroom. And as a result of that confusion and chaos, they're either too chaotic or too repressive in their new methods, and it just created more discomfort and resistance from students. So PD and resources are huge if you're going to make these changes, and I think state policymakers can make sure that more resources are allocated for that. So a couple suggestions there. I'm sure there are many more.
Thank you, Eric. We have a comment from Andy Boylan. She would like to say that a good resource is International Institute of Restorative Practices. Thank you, Andy. And
fantastic.
We have another question from Patty Saka. She asked, any suggestions on how to obtain staff buy-in regarding school climate and developing mentoring-like schools?
Fantastic. Yeah, that's a great question. I love it that you're thinking already about some of the resistance you're likely to hear and experience among teachers who may not be ready to move in this direction. And so I'll respond with a strategy, and the strategy is appeal to their own motivations and sense of engagement and their needs to feel like they're showing up for meetings. They all have to attend faculty meetings, of course, but when they're there, oftentimes people are checked out, and there's a reason why there's sort of a chronic, even though they're there, chronic absenteeism among some faculty, and that's because I think a lot of teachers started out their careers with really high expectations and a lot of hope about how they're going to relate to kids the way that they wanted to or maybe did experience those relationships when they were students. And somehow along the way, typically because they weren't as skilled in classroom management or in reaching across and meeting and the needs of students who are different from them, that they ended up sort of getting mistakes and having their feelings hurt, that students didn't love them the way that they thought that they would be loved. And the solution to that, if you're not provided with enough supports and you don't know how to fix it and you don't have the right books or the research in front of you, is to sort of chrome plate your heart and get a little snarky about it and decide to blame students and families and then decide to blame the enlightened administrators or faculty who are telling you that it's time for you to make a change. And that is a really sad and delicate and also an understandable sort of, again, I'm making the analogy, that's sort of teachers showing up but also not showing up for the work. And I think really good leaders at schools honor and acknowledge the pain of having decided to blame kids and families for the problems that we often create for them, and to go right to that as early and as often as you can, and to hold people in that space in some sort of way by saying, you seem like you've decided to keep yourself insulated from the possibility that you might be making mistakes in the classroom. And I think that's alienating you from your students. How can I help you with that? And I know that sounds touchy-feely, but that's exactly what we would do with a student who's not showing up to school too. What are we doing to not it seems like you've had some negative experiences here. How can we learn from that and move on, and what can we be doing differently to meet your needs? Now, one way to connect once you've opened that door with those particular ones is to get them looking at each other's practices, give them some hope, give them some little wins. And then when you go and observe them, after they observe somebody else who might be better at reaching and teaching certain kids that may be alienated and marginalized, go in and observe that particular teacher and find something positive to say, and don't give them any of the negative feedback yet. Just walk in, observe for a little bit, and say, I saw you interact with those two students at the back and the way that they lit up. I know that you can do this. I want to work with you to make sure you make all your kids light up in that way. Give them an opportunity in a way that they can see little wins will move to greater proficiency with the kids that they most need to teach. Don't write them off, because they'll sink the ship with the negativity in the faculty lounges. And I've seen it happen. We've all seen it happen. And then the third thing I would say is get them really connected to the data. Have them participate in analyzing the data, so that when they say things, and I'm stereotyping here, like those kids don't want to learn, you've got enough 5 or 6 other faculty around them who are saying, that's not the right approach here. There's a different way to understand that. I went to this crazy webinar by this nutty professor who said these weird things last week, and he said this, like whatever it may be. But surround that particular teacher with other people who think differently and get them to look at the actual data that help them to drill in. So some suggestions there.
Thanks, Eric. We don't have any other questions as of now.
Then let's go to this last slide and conclude. I think we're pretty close to the top of the hour here anyway. So sorry about the shameless plug here, but I do want to say that I wrote this book basically to target these very issues. Why is it that students choose not to come to school, to resist, to withdraw, to withhold effort, to misbehave, to throw spitwads in class, or whatever it may be? And my approach in this book is to really understand those behaviors as a form of resistance and what might inspire that resistance, both in the students' own psychological needs, their political situation at school and how they relate to other groups and society, and then the pedagogical factors that we create for them that make them not want to be there, or make them, while they are there, want to resist everything. So recommend that to you. And I also would recommend, again, we don't have a specific date for when the website's going to go live. We're building a whole lot of stuff right now behind the scenes, but when we do, I have a long list of resources that I'm going to upload that will be attached to this particular presentation that will be uploaded and saved there for later downloading. So you'll be able to check back there, and we'll have a bunch of resources available for you to link to or to download directly. So please check back there. And also just know that this process, this thing that we're working on between Johns Hopkins, the Federal Department of Education, the Everyone Graduate Center, the National Mentoring Partnership, Attendance Works, the My Brother's Keeper, and our work at Jobs for the Future, that this is a really ambitious effort, and we are looking forward to your feedback, your involvement, and your inclusion in this. If there are things that you think we need to be thinking about, we hope that you'll reach out to us. If there are things that you're doing on the ground that you think are particularly effective in this regard that we need to know more about, we hope that you'll reach out to us. And we look forward to collaborating with you in the future. Before that, I hand it back to Dentel. I want to thank Dentel for all her always terrific work in setting this stuff up, and I thank you all for attending. Dentel, I'll leave it with you for the final word.
Thanks, Eric. Thank you, everyone, for attending today. We hope that you found this webinar helpful and informative, and we look forward to the next one. Thanks, everyone.